Hello, welcome folks to Invisible Giant, the briefing and conversation from Fund the People about the power of the nonprofit workforce. My name is Rusty. I'm President and CEO at Fund the People, and I'm pleased to have you with us today. We have over 100 folks registered for the webinar. We appreciate your time during these stressful and challenging times being here. Today's session is not all things nonprofit sector, and it's not all things pandemic. We're going to focus on the strength and power of the nonprofit sector as workforce in particular. Pull up my slides here. Fund the People's mission is to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. Why do we care about that? Because we believe that the nonprofit workforce is a critical and essential part of the American system of democracy and of our economy. And we believe that the future of work is nonprofit. Nonprofit healthcare, nonprofit credit unions, nonprofit media, nonprofit news. This is the kind of system we need. And everyone on this call is a part of that. On this session, registrants include nonprofit fundraisers and executives. We have funders, we have scholars, we have consultants. So pleased to have a diverse array of folks. I want to thank Fund the People's supporters who are here named on screen. Couldn't be doing this without them. The agenda for today, we have a pretty packed agenda. We're going to start with Dr. Lester Salamon, then move to Jan Masaoka, Donna Murray Brown, and then Chai Jindasurat. All right, so we're going to get to it. I'm going to stop sharing here. So we're going to start sort of big picture with research about the nonprofit workforce, and then we're going to hear some regional leaders in terms of how the workforce looks and feels and operates in communities. Let me just introduce our speakers very briefly. Dr. Lester Salamon is professor at the Johns Hopkins University and director of Johns Hopkins University's Center for Civil Society Studies. Jan Masaoka is the chief executive officer of the California Association of Nonprofits, otherwise known as CalNonprofits, a statewide policy alliance and the voice of California's nonprofit community. Donna Murray Brown is president and CEO of Michigan Nonprofit Association, known as MNA, and she's also board chair of the National Council of Nonprofits, whose president and CEO we had on our April webinar. Finally, Chai Jindasurat is policy director of Nonprofit New York, the network of nonprofits for New York City. Okay, so let's get going here. By the way, we also have with us Vanessa, who is producing this webinar. So thank you, Vanessa, for being here. And if folks have any logistical issues along the way, you can chat with producer in all caps in the chat. That's Vanessa. So we couldn't be doing this without Vanessa. So let's start with you, Dr. Salamon. Your team at Johns Hopkins has pioneered a data-driven study on the economic impact of nonprofit employment in the US. What's the data source that you all have tapped, and why should every nonprofit and every government official be aware of it?
Right. Well, let me make clear at first that this is not a report. It is a whole continuing series of reports that we've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. Let me also note, for those of you who hear a very loud noise in the background, my house seems to come with a regular lawnmower whenever I turn on a webinar, so I apologize for that. So, in my view, what Rusty's organization is about is the best way to measure the impact and the scale of the nonprofit sector. This is a sector that is not as well known for its financial clout, though it does have enormous financial clout. But it's the people that really are the heart of this sector. And the best measure of that clout is really the people. And it's not just paid employment, it's also volunteer employment, which we also have focused on. The trouble is that this has been invisible in our national statistics and in statistics in other parts of the world. We do have in the Census Bureau something called the service industry database. It does break out tax-exempt organizations, but unless you are a very close reader of the appendix, you will not notice that they have just excluded two rather significant components of the nonprofit sector: higher education and hospitals. I mean, it's just totally bizarre, and people were reporting their figures without realizing that. The 990 has now recently begun to do that, that is to capture employment. But the people who do the 990 forms are not particularly skilled at employment data. They don't understand the differences between full-time and part-time employment. They don't have criteria for classification. And so we have been at a loss to measure and portray this really crucial component of the nonprofit sector. But our colleagues at Johns Hopkins Center discovered that there is an enormous database that has been in existence since the 1930s. It is the database that is associated with the unemployment insurance system in the United States. Nonprofits are required to do something in relation to that unemployment insurance system. This is a system that captures not a sample, which these other sources do, but they take the entire universe of nonprofit employment, and they not only do that at the establishment level, at the organization level, but they take it down to the establishment level. And this is very important in economic data because many, many firms now have multiple establishments. And if you only take the data at the organization level, all of the data is attributed to wherever the headquarters of the organization is located. So you can't see the spread of this organization or the spread of this sector across jurisdictions, into the suburbs, across the country. And so our challenge was, how do we get this out of these computers? Because we knew that sitting in the computers at the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, was the most incredible body of data on nonprofit employment that has ever been conceived. But it was never reported. The only thing that BLS would report is the total of private employment. It never broke out nonprofits. And so we were confined to losing one of the most powerful pictures of the nonprofit sector. So we went to work and we discovered several ways in which we could crack into this database. Essentially, in the era of high-speed computers, if you can find another database that captures these organizations, and if you can find a code in the other databases that allow you to make the linkage, you could link up the data in the BLS computers to some concept, and a pretty reasonable concept, of the nonprofit sector. So my team is, I must confess, very lazy. We do not like to go out and collect data from every nonprofit in the country. It's just a fool's errand. So here we were sitting on just an incredible database. And with the permission of the BLS, we were able to get access to their computers. They let us run our data tapes against their computers. And suddenly, voila, we had opened a treasure chest of data. So this is the source of data. It is the most comprehensive picture of the data on nonprofit employment that has ever been created. We cracked into it, I would say, in the early 2000s, and we have been mining it ever since. And it is just a marvelous resource. So any of you who have not been aware of this, I would urge you, please take a look at it. We have actually created a special website that allows anybody anywhere in the country to go on that website and find how many nonprofits are working in their community and in which fields. and with how many employees and what the wages are. So it is just a fantastic resource. And we have converted it into a accessible database. It's called Nonprofit Works. So that's the database. So if I can, I'll just go ahead and talk about some of the things that we've learned.
We're gonna walk through, and we will send out a link to folks to the database website so that everyone can get.
The data, I should say, I saw one query as this began. We are about to issue our latest report. It's going to be the 2020 nonprofit employment report. The BLS is backlogged. The data that we get for 2020 and for our 2020 report is 2017 data. So I need you to be aware of that. And we've gotten the BLS now, not only to let us go into their computers, but to do it themselves. But they have so far only agreed to do it every 5 years. And we have been pounding on them. And I would welcome the rest of the sectors helping us pound on them to basically say, this is not sufficient. You know, the banking industry gets data every year, and the insurance industry and every other industry. Why in the world do we not get our data? And this would not be such a big problem if this were trivial, but it's not trivial. It turns out, and this is the first finding that we have come up with, that the nonprofit workforce is the third largest workforce in America of all the various industries in the country. I don't know if you have a slide you want to put up on this or not. The only two industries that exceed it are retail, trade, and accommodation and food services. And one of the more astounding facts about America that people simply have not understood is that there are more people working on in the nonprofit sector, paid work, this is not including volunteers even, than there are in every single branch of manufacturing. And we know for sure that the manufacturing numbers are a very powerful element in political discussions about the importance of different industries. Well, we've got an industry that has got more people employed than does the entire manufacturing sector. Much higher than construction, as you can see, much higher than finance and insurance, much higher than every other industry in the country. And economists break economies down into 5 different industries. So it's a huge industry. And if you look in particular fields where nonprofits are active, the numbers are even more astounding. So for example, 71% of all private education is run by nonprofit workers. 84% in the elementary and secondary field, 92% in the higher education field. These are private schools. Similarly, in the healthcare field, 84% of the employment in our hospitals is in nonprofit hospitals, private nonprofit hospitals. 35% in nursing homes, 41% in social assistance. So we're talking about in fields of really social importance to the country, a sector that is the dominant force in many of the key fields. So this is, really big news, and it's something that we should not overlook. And that translates, of course, into payrolls. Everybody's wringing their hands about how small the wages are of nonprofits. We have actually found that when you look in the same industries between nonprofits and for-profits, that the nonprofits actually outdistance the for-profits in terms of their wages. But overall, and this is this next, I think it's a slide after this, it is not only the third largest workforce, it is the third largest payroll. And payroll, of course, translates into tax revenue. It translates into sales tax revenue. And so the idea that nonprofits are somehow not pulling their weight is simply a myth that we all have to get behind and destroy. So it's the third largest payroll, in addition to being the third largest industry. It's got $670 billion of wages. By comparison, finance and insurance, everybody, the whole Wall Street gang, they're about 623. So this is a sector that has got a lot of claim to be a pretty powerful force in our economy, and we just have not been making that argument.
Now,
So
it's a little hard in the slide to see the numbers at the end of the green nonprofit line. Can you just?
yeah, I'm
in
not
white?
sure why that's the case. This is another one. This is the growth rate. So
Sorry.
yeah, that helped. I don't know. It's I don't know why there are two numbers there, 623 and 657. I do not understand the second number in those charts, so we will have to. I'll have to get my able assistant to figure this out. But you can see the scale of the bars, and the scale of the bars is correct. There is much more economic activity going on here than in most other industries in the country.
And this doesn't even include unpaid labor, all those,
Absolutely. It does not include the volunteer work. So, this is, again, a massive story. And not only is it large, but it is growing at a faster rate than is the growth of the for-profit business sector. And I don't know which chart we have to indicate this, but fundamentally, there it is. Well, you went past it.
There it is. There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Tell us about this, because this relates to the Great Recession, as well as a broader scope. So yeah, we'd love to hear what these three columns.
So we first looked at the period from 2007 to 2012, and one of the striking things that emerged from that is that the nonprofits sort of stay the course. They don't turn tail and run when the economy turns down. They just find some way to stay the course. So in the period of the previous Great Recession, they grew by 8.5%, while the for-profit sector was declining by 4.1%. Then once the economies returned, the for-profits resumed their scale, their growth, but not by a lot. And so for the whole period from 2007 to 2017, the growth of the nonprofit sector was close to 19 or 20%, whereas the growth of the for-profit business sector was about 6%. So again, this is a story that simply has not been told, hasn't been told by the media, has not been told by our government, and has not been told really by the sector itself. So what we've now done is to see what's happening in the recession. So several points here, and I don't want to belabor this, but as you know, the Payroll Protection Plan opened up assistance to so-called small businesses. But in everybody's head, of course, small businesses meant small for-profit enterprises. They completely forgot about nonprofits. But it turns out that 97% of the nonprofits are under the threshold for support in that program. About 97% of the total, the threshold is 500 employees. And even with the numbers that we have, which are not perfect, unfortunately, this is the sector that's being walloped in the recession. And we have made an early estimate of what has been happening to the nonprofit sector during the recession, particularly since it is active in these crucial fields of human resources and human social services. And if we assume that the rate of loss of nonprofit jobs is equivalent to the share that nonprofits represent in these different fields, then we can estimate what the job loss of the nonprofits has been, given that we have data now, which we've gotten from BLS, on the overall job losses in different fields. And I'm not sure if we have this. This chart is not right, so take it down. I'll walk us through it.
Okay.
I'm going to have to talk to my dear colleague Chelsea, because the heading of the slide, the column is wrong. But fundamentally, of the total job losses, nonprofits accounted for an enormous amount of them. We estimate that 2.3 million nonprofit jobs were lost through April. We're waiting to get the May numbers in order to get a clearer picture of the 2-month loss. This assumes that they lost at the same rate that they represented in the employment in these different fields. And in some fields, of course, the nonprofit losses were big numbers. You know, there were 70–80% of the nonprofit jobs in those fields. That's true in the health field and in the human service fields. So bottom line here, this sector represents an enormous part of the American labor force. That fact has been obscured by the lack of data. We now have very solid data. The data is not produced by us anymore, going into the computers of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics professionals, and they're striking. They're just absolutely overwhelming. We have not yet convinced the BLS to update these as quickly as we want. We're on their back to try to get them to do 2020. So we have a current picture of this, but I think everybody should come away from this session saying, oh my God, we have a component of the economy that we simply are not trumpeting. This is ridiculous for us. Every other industry, you better believe they're in the Congress pointing to how many people are working in their industry. Half the states in the United States have more nonprofit employees than they have employment in manufacturing. That's just an astounding fact that has a political implication to it that we simply need to focus on and take advantage of. So I'm sorry if I took
this
time than was allocated.
This was great, and your passion comes through, and I think is shared by all the panelists here. We had a great question come in from Jesse Lee, one of our participants. Is there any traction or effort to influence policies at federal, state, and local level to create better visibility? Somebody else says, definitely a story that needs to be told widely and discussed more deeply. So, you know, what's great is that, you know, on our last webinar last month, which is available to stream, and we'll send out the link to folks, we had the president and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits, which led a huge coalition to make sure nonprofits were counted in the payroll protection loans. On this call, we have 3 member organizations from California, New York, and Michigan, 3 major hubs of the nonprofit workforce and of philanthropy to talk with us. So we're going to turn to those, and thank you for sort of setting that context, and thank you for everything you've done in terms of getting that data and telling that story so far, Dr. Salamon. So let's turn now to Jen Masaoka from CalNonprofits, one of the leading sort of networks of nonprofits in our country. And Jen is certainly a powerhouse in our sector. There's a lot she's done. But let me just start, Jen, and thanks for being here. You all have put out a couple reports, most recently last year, called Causes Count, the Economic Power of California's Nonprofit Sector. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found there and any other thoughts coming out of what's been said?
Thanks. You know, it's always daunting to follow Les Solomon, right? It's like, it's impossible to sound either smart or informed after him. So you have to, I want to apologize in advance for that. So yeah, thanks for asking about the reports. I think one of the things that we, instead of using the word invisible, like you used in the title of this, we use the phrase hidden in plain sight. 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit organization. And, you know, you've heard a million times, you've heard people say something like, well, what can we do to boost construction jobs? And we always say, you know, we don't need to boost other sectors' jobs. We are jobs. We are a sector of jobs. And so part of what we do as a policy alliance is to take this information, which Lester has said on a national scale, and we have it in California, and turn it into a set of policy demands. And this is the best time ever to do that. Because, you know, first of all, nonprofits have never been more visible and never seen as more critical. Every day you see food banks and Meals on Wheels and health clinics and, you know, centers for children and doing heroic work. At the same time, of course, in the nonprofit community, all of our theaters and museums are closed. So on one hand, we have high visibility and then we have lowest visibility, but nonetheless, we nonprofits are in every part of that spectrum. I think one of the reasons why nonprofit employment, first of all, is not taken up enough as a policy question is partly because people think of it in subsectors. They think about it in the arts or in healthcare and those kinds of things. But also because we need to say something more about it than, well, we're really big, you know, and so one of the things we think it's important for us to be able to say is that California nonprofits generate 15% of our state domestic product. All right, it's our state GDP. So we are a big part of the economy. And maybe the most important number we ever use in our state capital is this, that we bring $40 billion with a B, into California every year from out of state. Right, so it's not that by having a lot of employees, we are using up money in California. Our employees are bringing money into the state. And the equivalent of 330,000 full-time staff is what our volunteer workforce looks like. So just one last point, and that is that, you know, so right now everybody's talking about how do we invest in it to make a robust economy, right? And I think the answer is invest in nonprofits. And here's why. So first of all, when you give money to nonprofits, we spend it right away. We spend it locally. We spend it in lower income communities and in rural communities. And we stay in those communities. The money stays in those communities. It doesn't go anywhere else. Secondly, we have a very high multiplier effects. Just one example is how many volunteers we bring into economic activity, which, you know, neither the government nor the business sector are very good at all. And I think that we bring money in from out of state. We are more diverse, particularly in staff leadership positions, by a very wide range in gender and race and ethnicity. Than either government or the for-profit sector. So we all know that, you know, in coming out of this COVID situation, we are all working to make sure that the inequalities which are making the situation worse need to be addressed. And so investing in nonprofits is not only a high economic multiplier, keeps the money in local communities and in disadvantaged communities, it inherently acts to mitigate against some of the disparities that are so ingrained in our community. So that's one of the most important things, I think, is how we can all use data about employment to talk about. And so what that means is this is why this has to happen during the recovery period.
Yeah, in our state, I watched the Governor Cuomo press conferences, and the other day he was talking about the need to invest in infrastructure, and that's the, you know, we need to do that anyway. We need to grow jobs now, and so it's the perfect time to sort of do the infrastructure funding agenda that all the presidents have talked about for the last 20 years and haven't done. But you know, it's all about yeah. So
the way for us to talk about infrastructure is, right, I think we've all learned more about the food chain, right? The food supply chain. It's how we get food from farms goes to drivers and truckers and warehouses and right until it finally gets to consumers. And one way to understand us is we are the services supply chain. And like a supply chain, we need our infrastructure to be supported and nurtured, just like every other crucial part of our supply chains in America.
Yeah, well put. I wanted to ask you, when you talk to policymakers at the state level or in cities, do you think they get it? I mean, you've said how you make the case, but what do you find when you go up on these Capitol buildings? Like, what's the reception? Is it a blank stare?
I would say, first of all, that elected officials are very good at telling everybody they talk to how impressed they are with what they've just been told. So This is true for anybody. So I sometimes think that when we nonprofits do that, we sometimes think, wow, but we need to pay attention to the fact that, yeah, that's great that you're wowed by this data. The more important thing is, here's the 6 bills that we need you to vote on. And this is what you need to do. And one other thing I think we need to think about our volunteer and nonprofit paid workforces is that we could be a voting bloc. Okay. And instead of thinking ourselves as just people who have sort of similar types of jobs, we are a voting bloc. And one of the ways we talk about that is to say things like, if everybody who worked or volunteered in children's services voted, we'd have better children's services funding. If everybody who worked or volunteered in the environment voted, we'd have better environmental policies. So the fact is that if our workforce, both paid and volunteered, take our missions into the voting booth, okay, we can make a huge difference. And we have a couple of slogans. One of them is like, I work at a nonprofit and I vote.
I love it. I love it. Well, on that note, I think that's a good point of what politicians say to us and then how we use our power strategically to actually change policy are two different things. Thanks, Jen, and thanks for staying on with us for some more questions. A comment that's come in, Vanessa tells me, Jane Pollan says, the shoemaker's children have no shoes. Nonprofit advocates for employment we advocate for employment in other industries, but not enough for our own.
Well, I just say one last thing about that. So one of our staff used to be a lobbyist for the SPCA, and one of the things she says is, for 9 years, I lobbied for dogs and cats and whales and kangaroos and birds, and I never once lobbied for the SPCA. And I think that that's what infrastructure is about, is lobbying and arguing for organizations as well as for our communities.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you. Okay, let's turn. We're doing good, making good time here. I hope it doesn't feel too rushed to everyone like it does to me, because there's so much that could be said. But let's turn to Donna Murray Brown over in Michigan. Thanks for being here, Donna. And not only are you the CEO at the Michigan Nonprofit Association, but also board president or chair of the national sort of umbrella that brings all of these state and regional associations and nonprofits together. So feel free to pivot back and forth between those perspectives if you like. Sure. So thanks for being here. I wanted to start, you all have been, your state has been in the news unfortunately for a couple different disasters going on, really both natural and man-made things happening at the same time. But the collapse of the Edenville Dam, as well as the pandemic response and everything. So I wondered, I know it, at least it's been on my mind, so I wondered, I think others may be seeing that, the dam impact in the news. And I wondered if you might share with us, how nonprofit folks are stepping up, because we don't hear about that in the news.
Yeah, absolutely not. Let me just say, I am on fire right now with all the comments that I've heard from my colleagues. And so I'm trying to keep my emotions down here, but I will answer your question. So interestingly, in Michigan, we hear about the Edenville Dam, but there was actually, that ruptured, and there was another dam, the Sanford Dam, actually, that was also breached. So there were two pieces of infrastructure in a very small community that actually made for the disaster. And so, as you would know, and probably everyone on this Zoom call webinar, is that nonprofit organizations, because we're so nimble and because we are so proximate to the community, we knew right away, and we organized right away. So United Way, along with the Herbert H. and Grace A. Dow Foundation, quickly put a fund together. I believe the Herbert H. Foundation provided $500,000 immediately, and provided a match fund of another $500,000 that they were willing to match. So $1 million into a fund right away. United Way also coordinated with the largest employer in Midland County in the Midland area, which is Dow. And so together they worked to be able to provide some of the needed items that people would need in terms of amenities, baby items, food, and all of those things. Of course, food and basic need organizations rallied immediately to be able to provide those resources, almost as if it happened and they were there on the spot, like nonprofits typically are.
Yeah, first responders, right? Like first
responders, exactly.
The last offenders really there.
Yeah.
That's well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I want to ask you kind of the same thing I asked Jen. Like when you go up to the state capitol or other policymakers at the federal level or local level, you know, what do you think is their perception of Michigan's nonprofit workforce or the nonprofit workforce? What do you think is effective in educating them?
So a couple of things. I think before, I'm going to say before the pandemic, and then what I see happening now. So overall, before, I think it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. And so let me just say, I haven't been in the nonprofit sector all of my career. Much of my career was in banking for 22 years and only 10 years in the nonprofit sector. So it was really interesting, even my own view coming into the nonprofit sector from the private sector was this sense of nonprofit organizations are not really businesses. They don't necessarily really contribute to the economy. Of course, that's not accurate. And I think some of the elected officials that I see in Michigan, some of them know about the nonprofit sector, but their perspective is it's not necessarily a business. It doesn't necessarily need to generate revenue. It's not necessarily an employer because everyone volunteers, don't they, in a nonprofit organization? And so that generally is what I find to be the case. However, since COVID-19 and the ability for nonprofit organizations, especially those that are meeting basic needs, how fast they were able to galvanize themselves, how they were called upon really for data and information from elected officials and from the government. We were the first they came to say, so tell me, you know, how do we help community? What's the best way to do that? One of the things that kind of rises up to the top for me, maybe personally because I happen to live in Detroit, and COVID-19 in Detroit, as it relates to you know, that particular area in Michigan, was really, really hit hard and with COVID-19, and in particular, the African-American community was really hit hard. So much so that the governor created a racial disparity task force, if you will. And so when it was announced, I was really thrilled about that. But the first thing I did is said, who's on this task force? So out of 23 slots on the task force, I was encouraged to know outside of the government agencies, there were 20 of them were nonprofit leaders. Of course they are. Again, we're proximate to the work, but they have the knowledge and the expertise to be able to inform how do we make sense of African Americans being 14% of the population, yet 40% of the confirmed cases of COVID-19. So, so that work is really being spearheaded, albeit convened by the governor's office, but it is being led by nonprofit organizations at the table, providing their expertise and knowledge and making a difference in that particular area in particular.
Yeah, and a really important point about the pandemic, obviously, and it is, yeah, it's good to hear the nonprofits are at that table, both that they've been asked and that they have hopefully have the ability to do what's needed to be done. Yeah, thank you for that example. It does, yeah. So one thing I've seen in your state is you've created a nonprofit caucus in your legislature, in the House and Senate, and then the foundations, I think, and nonprofits have created this liaison from the governor's office that has survived Republican and Democratic administrations. And I don't know if that's because it's funded by the foundations or has some other durability, but I guess my big question is, like, has that helped at all in terms of the understanding of employment, wages, economic contribution of the sector to the state among these policymakers?
I think so. I think in Michigan, and I'm told this might be very different in other states, the first premise is that we, as a state association, work with the Regional Grantmaker Association, Council of Michigan Foundations in our case in Michigan. which is a really great relationship. So we partner in everything. And so we wanted to create this infrastructure where nonprofits, the sector itself, was not only acknowledged, but we were able to have a vehicle by which we could advance policies and have discussions around how we can improve communities across the entire state. And so not only do we have the Office of the Foundation Liaison that works directly with the executive branch, and then we have the Nonprofit Caucus that works with the legislative branch, we also have a relationship with the Attorney General's office at the regulatory branch for nonprofits. And so this has proven to be extremely helpful because there's an understanding within those groups. However, I also want to be careful to say that, like with any relationship and with term limits and all of those other things, you have to continue to nurture, educate, and inform. And it really requires routine and routine meetings and routine engagement and activities. And that's really been the role that Michigan Nonprofit Association has positioned itself for in creating this table, if you will, these several tables to be able to make certain that the needs of nonprofits were acknowledged and advanced and dealt with. So that has been super, I think, effective. However, never resting on our laurels with this, because again, soon as, new election, new people, new terms, then you've got another group of people, right, that you're having to inform and educate. We do have an economic impact report that we create too in the state of Michigan that is another tool for us. But I am drinking the Kool-Aid of Dr. Salamon, and I'm thinking that we need to have a campaign. So when you mentioned me being the chair for the National Council, like, is there a way? Because I think data, facts, and all of that matters. I think storytelling matters, but I think an organized campaign, and Jan made a really good point, is because we are so diverse and we're in these subsectors that it seemingly makes it challenging for us to kind of coordinate that. But I feel like we can coordinate that. I think that it just is a commitment to that. And honestly, I think this time period, being COVID-19, is the best time to actually lift that up while we are very visible, to be able to advance that as a campaign of sorts, if you will. And so I think aside from us having this great infrastructure in Michigan, we don't have the BLS actually creating those statistics and data for us on a regular basis. We need to have that, but we need to be able to have a coordinated campaign, not only to get the regular data, but also to have the communication, not just to elected officials, but to communities and to the country at large, to say, this is what it means, and this is the contributions of nonprofit organizations across the country. So I'm on board. I'm ready to go.
Me too. I'm game for that. I think it's ridiculous that the PPP, the National Council and all these groups lobbied. We got nonprofits in there, or you all got nonprofits in there. But when, as Dr. Salamon had pointed out to me in prep for this, when the media talks about it, when policymakers talk about it, they glaze over that. They just say small businesses. So even though it's in the policy, it's invisible. That's why we use the term invisible giant, because they're not talking about us, even though they're including us. So then the general public doesn't know necessarily.
Well, and this is a long conversation that we would probably have to have around this, but it's easy to say private sector and business, you get that. It's not easily understood because of the diversity of our sector to say nonprofit. What does that mean? We have several different designations in terms of what that means. It's very unclear to understand. So we have to make it clear for people. We have to do that. And we can't sometimes be a business and not be a business, because sometimes we vacillate as a sector around that too. And so it's really about having a consistent, coordinated messaging, I think, campaign. And we've got the substance, behind what we do. So we've got plenty of substance. We just need to be able to communicate, I think, collectively and succinctly about what we do and who we are.
Terrific. Well, thanks. I think that's a great segue to our final speaker and moving us all the way east from California, Michigan to New York City. Chai, are you with us here? And thanks, Donna, for all of those thoughts. Hello, Chai. Thanks for your time and everything you've been doing on public policy issues in New York City, both at the state and city level and national level. I know you've been working on all three. So welcome to the conversation here. I think of New York City as the capital city of the nonprofit workforce of the nonprofit sector because it's such a hub. Of course, that's my bias. I lived there 15 years. You know, can you tell us about how you, sitting as kind of the association for nonprofits in the city, how you see the strength and power of the workforce in New York City?
Sure. Thanks, Rusty. And hi, everyone. As Rusty said, I'm Chai. And first, I just want to say it's such an honor to be part of this briefing with Lester, Jan, and Donna. And I echo so much. I've been tweeting. I've been taking notes. I've been just like here cheering everybody on. I feel like there's so many things that you've said that I was planning to say. So hopefully that'll save us a little bit of time. But in terms of New York City, I mean, yeah. So one note, Rusty, in terms of like the capital and I guess just like the size of New York is that our city budget is bigger than 48 state budgets. That's just to give the scale of the resources within New York City. And our nonprofit workforce in New York City is actually higher than the national average. So New York City's nonprofits employ 16% of the private workforce, which is 6% higher than the national average. When you look at different boroughs, we're some of the best jobs in New York City. So in the Bronx, we're 34% of the workforce and have some of the best wages. And in Staten Island, we're 25% of the private workforce. When we look into different subsectors, our arts and culture organizations employ 300,000 people and pay over $20 billion in wages. And we also know that they are a big driver of global tourism to the city. But they were also the first to have to shut down. And within our state's plan, they're going to be the last to open up. And then our health and human services organizations that are on the front line, as Jan said, you know, there's such a spread of organizations that are continuing to work or that are like hibernating. And those arts and culture organizations are employing over 40,000 people through 3,000 organizations, just to give a few examples of the power of our sector. Oh, Rusty, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry, I put one of your visuals up here. I hope that's the right one. I can flip to the other as well, but
yes,
so
that's good.
I wanted to ask you, you know, this question again. How do you, when you're up there talking to policymakers, what's the perception both, and you could talk about this, I know you've been in this role for a year, so what was before pandemic, what's now in terms of perception? And what do you think has been effective in educating folks?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that I've been in the role for a year, because then it makes me think about my prior work. And so not to go off too much, but just before I was working at Nonprofit New York, I was working in the city's, the mayor's office of management and budget, and my special kind of portfolio area was social services, and I did a lot of nonprofit contracting. And prior to that, I was a community organizer, so that's kind of how I got into the nonprofit sector. And I would say that to answer your question, it depends on the level of government. It depends on what part of the government. And I would say, you know, potentially safe space, actually, I don't really care, but the city's kind of the worst right now. I would say federally, what's been really interesting is we have been included in a lot of the relief efforts. But as everybody has said, you know, the New York congressional delegation has been really important to the leadership of some of the massive federal efforts, from CARES to Families First to now the House passed the HEROES Act, I think it was last week, and then today they passed the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act. However, even representatives from our city who I love very, very much, and I love their staff and we work really closely with them, they always go on record or in their press release, they say, you know, we created this program to support small businesses. Technically, those programs do support nonprofits, but they don't really say that, and the media doesn't report it. I will say, though, that I have to give a big shout out to Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, because she consistently talks about nonprofits and even introduced the Pandemic Risk Insurance Act on Tuesday. And that's, you know, a very like business market focused bill with all these trade associations, and still even then like really lifted up nonprofits. So I would say it just depends. With our state legislation, the legislature came back to session this week and it has been extremely active. And I will say that I'm very grateful that almost all the pieces of legislation aimed at supporting small businesses specifically include nonprofits. So it really just depends. But I would say, as everyone else has said, that when it comes to the city, they treat us very much as a fractured sector. So they deal with just the human services sector in a particular way, just the arts sector in a particular way, health, community development, housing, whatever it is, it's very fractured. And they don't really, I would say, generally consider us as a unified sector.
Mm. Yeah, and if we don't consider ourselves a unified sector, it's hard to get other people to see us that way. And so I think it is about a framing. Now, I know you all sent a letter to, I think, City Council around the role of nonprofits, and you got one media and, op-ed sort of. Can you talk about that? And I'll put that up on screen.
Sure, yeah. So I see we're running a little tight on time. So I just want to kind of, if it's okay, Rusty, I will kind of close it out with this question. And we've done a ton of letters. We've been coordinating kind of a sector-wide response to COVID and just the threat to our existence basically since mid-March. And we kind of started with a letter to all our government leaders at all levels. It was signed by over 500 organizations, and we made a list of demands. We've then done specific letters to City Council, we've done a couple letters to our congressional delegation. We've held town halls with Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand. We've done a lot of letters for specific state legislative efforts, but I would say, this is really when we flex our power and when we really do coordinate, we're seeing that make a difference in the ways that we're included in different policy efforts. And so, this particular op-ed came out a couple of days ago, and it's a couple of city council members from the Bronx who were highlighting how important it is to center us in the budget negotiations that are happening on the city level. And it was just kind of nice to see, because we hadn't really seen our letter to our government leaders referenced for a while, and this is something we sent back in March. So, the coordination we're doing now is really investing in our power for the future as well.
Thanks, Chai. I know we are short on time, so we're going to turn to our questions here. One question that came in from the board chair at YNP and Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, Robert Nelson, one of our partners, is there more racial data for the nonprofit workforce that any of our presenters could speak to that?
I can get that started if you want. So this is something we've been looking at from a couple different angles, and I know we have great partners through Building Movement Project, which has done a series of national surveys on the racial equity gap within the nonprofit sector. And we do know, there is a racial leadership gap. People of color are less likely to be in the C-suite positions. And so we've been kind of trying to grapple with that as a sector. Here in New York City, there's again, like they break it down by subsector, but the cultural sector in particular has some data on the lack of cultural diversity from some of our major cultural institutions, and how some of the smaller community of color led arts organizations have some of the least amount of resources. So we definitely see structural racism in the data when we take a look at it.
And that actually speaks to something we wanted to talk about, Chai, that about how you've seen sort of these equity issues playing out with government contracting in the city to nonprofits. If you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I would just say kind of quickly, once we start talking about contracting, it's easy to go down the minutia hole, but I'm going to try and keep it quick, and that is just that, government has outsourced a lot of their obligations to nonprofits, for better or for worse. And when the competitive bidding process means that you're able to really suppress certain contracts, and you can suppress certain line items like indirect cost rates, what that means is actually the frontline workers of that workforce bear the brunt of that. And in New York City, that means it's predominantly women of color who are some of the lowest wage workers, as a direct result of the way that the city kind of operates with nonprofits. And right now, like another thing, there's something we call in the city discretionary funding, which is city council specific allocated funding, which has a low barrier of entry. So some of the most grassroots, community of color led, immigrant led organizations, it's the only funding they can get. But we're facing like a $10 billion budget gap. And that is most likely going to be the first line that's going to be cut. So just a couple of examples of how we're really seeing the entire structure of funding reflect racial disparities.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on race and equity issues in the data or as things are playing out?
Yeah, I will. This is Jan. I think that even though people in the nonprofit community tend to think that, we are working against disparities, in fact, we reflect the disparities. And it's not just about gender and race and ethnicity. It's about rural versus metro. I mean, it's about a lot of things. It's about wealthy versus poor. And, one of the things we've done is look at the amount of money that the nonprofit community has in a given county per capita, per resident of that county. And it ranges, that's all the nonprofits together, all their money divided by the number of people that live in that county. And that ranges in California from a high of $14,000 per resident to $97 per resident. So in fact, the realities are, it's about rural versus metro, it's about predominantly people of color compared to predominantly white, and it's about poor versus wealthier. So all three of those disparities go hand in hand. And I think one of the things is that we need to advocate for with our foundation community is to be funding out of the areas in which they're located. Because it's completely understandable that, foundations tend to be located in wealthy areas because wealthy people founded them. And so so that doesn't think of them about funding something that may be, 200 miles away in a very different environment. I think this is a call to action for us to make to our foundation funders. And it's also a call to action, which is controversial in our community. Say realistically, more money has to go to rural communities. Rural communities in California are where poor people are and where people of color are.
Whew. Well, and I know some of the Johns Hopkins did a little press release about rural employment and urban employment, and that nonprofit employment is sort of still massive in rural areas as well as urban areas. So but that doesn't say that there's not inequities within and across those, but just that that's one stereotype. We may think of nonprofits as being bigger in cities than rural areas, but really across the landscape. We are coming to a close of our time here, unfortunately, and there are other questions. I'll share those questions with our panelists. If panelists have things they want to share back, resources to those who ask the questions, I will try to get those as a go-between to you all who ask questions. And we'll also get the slides out and links to resources from each of the organizations. And this has been recorded and will be available to all participants. We'll also be sending out an evaluation of this. So if you, as participants, have things you want to hear, speakers you want to hear from, topics, this webinar was planned based on feedback from the last webinar in the evaluation. So we will use your feedback to plan future sessions. So thank you to our presenters today. It was really terrific, and each of you could have taken, have the substance and leadership to fill up at least an hour minimum. So thank you for your time, and thanks for all you do in your communities. I'm just gonna briefly share a couple things from the people, just in case participants aren't familiar. We do have a toolkit to help you make the case for investing in staff in nonprofits. So there's the URL, fundthepeople.org/toolkit. And within that, we have our Talent Justice Initiative, which looks at investing in intersectional racial equity in the nonprofit workforce. And you can get to that directly at talentjustice.org. So we hope that also, there's 10 tools within that, along with our research, that I hope may be useful to you. Feel free to reach out to me directly at talentjustice.org, or follow us on Twitter at Fund the People. And to everyone, just in closing, remember to fund the people. Thank you all, and talk to you soon.